Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome back to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. We're looking at how David handles disappointment. He had it in his heart to build the temple, started moving in that direction, God interrupted his plans and said, "Hey, Dave, you're not the one to do it. It's going to be one of your sons." How does David deal with disappointment? Well, I don't know if he actually was thinking this, but we have the hindsight to understand that every disappointment is an appointment with God. I'm going to say that again. Every disappointment, the root of that word is appointment. There is an appointment in every disappointment for God to do something beyond what we understand. And sometimes God is really more concerned about what he does in us than what he's doing through us. Because if he does a bigger work in us, he can do a bigger work through us. How we respond in times of disappointment when we see others getting promoted, others getting that job, and us being on the sideline and us not being the qualified one and everybody else is. How do we manage and handle those disappointments inside of our heart? We learn from David. 1 Chronicles chapter 28 and verse 5 and 6. "And of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord of Israel. Now he said to me, it is your son Solomon who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him." David had sons to promote. What we see in the life of David is he was what the first commandment given to mankind, be fruitful and multiply. David was very successful at that. And unfortunately, what we'll find out in a later story is he was a little too successful at that, but he was fruitful and he multiplied and he had sons. And so what every leader should always be thinking about is, how am I reproducing myself? Because there will be some sons that I raise up and daughters that I raise up that will go on to continue to do great works for God that I wasn't able to do. The problem is when we don't duplicate ourselves, when we aren't being fruitful and multiplying and reproducing in us what we have, the gifts, the talents, the experience, and pouring those into other people, then ultimately what we have is we have no sons. 2 Timothy 2:2, Paul says to Timothy, "These things that you've heard and seen in me, commit thou to faithful others who will be able to teach others also." What you really see is 4 generations of duplication. We see Paul go, "Hey, you've seen this in me. I've poured it into you. Pour it into others who will pour it into others." We see 4 generations of duplication there. Now, Solomon had a son whose name was Absalom. We're going to learn about him a little bit here. And he was rebellious. He rebelled against his father, and he had no sons. Listen to this, 2 Samuel 18, verse 18. "Now, Absalom in his lifetime had taken to set up a pillar to of himself, which is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and to this day it is called Absalom's monument." When a leader does not reproduce themselves into the next generation and raising up successors, we become Absaloms, that because we have no succession, we ultimately just have to build a monument to ourselves. And you'll see this as you study business history, as you study church history. What you'll find is insecure leaders who didn't invest themselves into other leaders. When it was time to pass the baton, there was nobody to pass the baton to. Or they had people to pass the baton to, but they wouldn't let go of the baton. We look at Jack Welch, who was an incredible CEO of General Electric. He had multiple successors that he had been grooming over a period of time. And when it was time for him to step away, it really came down to which one would he choose. He had been grooming successors in that process. As pastors, we need to always be investing into the next generation, raising up future leaders. Hey, I love leading church. I love preaching the gospel. There'll come a day that I'll need to pass this church on to somebody else. Don't freak out. It's not anytime soon. But I'm raising up future leaders. So when you hear me on a weekend, actually, let me rephrase that. When you don't hear me on a weekend, because I have other communicators up in the pulpit, and you go, oh, I wanted to hear Pastor Eric. What am I doing? I'm actually doing my job. Let me say that again. I'm doing my job. I'm raising up spiritual sons, spiritual daughters who can grow up to be great communicators, someday pastors. And who knows, out of our own house, hopefully we'll raise up a successor that someday will be able to take the church further than I ever could, just like Solomon took the kingdom of Israel further than David did, and we have to be okay. If we don't, we just build monuments to ourselves. Your company, it's not your company if you're a Christian. Pastor, it's not your church if you're a pastor. We're just stewards, and we need to be raising up next generations. I heard of a great pastor who actually I've learned so much from over the years, that he was pushing like his late 70s, early 80s, and he had a successor that he had in place, but he wouldn't pass the church over. And he was literally at the point preaching in an oxygen mask. And then he preached a sermon, turned around, and died. Well, that's not how God intends it. I just don't think that's how it should have been. He should have passed the baton earlier, let that next generation leader who had more energy and strength and probably some fresh ideas, hand it off to them. And then, you know what? Stay around as a teaching pastor, stay around as Methuselah, granddad, and be the sage on the team. That's how I see it for me. I'm going to get old. I'm going to have things to say. They're going to let me preach some. When I say something, it's going to be really good because I was preaching a lot less and I had time to accumulate deep thoughts and I wasn't tired all the time. But that's the sign of a great leader. Who are you investing in? Who are you pouring yourself into that you could hand the batons of a department or a ministry? Now, a lot of people don't do this because they go, I'll lose my job. If I become indispensable, hey, the most indispensable leader is the one who can replace themselves by raising up other leaders. Only a fool would fire that leader who worked themselves out of a job. Because I know this, if you'll work yourself out of a job here, I'll move you somewhere else and you'll work yourself out of that job too. Because a leader that reproduces leaders is priceless. And so you become that leader. Reproduce leaders.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.